In Excel, it's common to find cross-tab layouts. This is where we have categorization on the left, but also across the top. The problem is that this is a difficult format to work with. It's much easier to calculate on values stored in a data layout in columns. Now we can unpivot a cross-tab layout in Power Query, but sometimes we don't want to use Power Query. So how can we unpivot with formulas? Well, that's what we're looking at in this video. So if you're ready, let's get started. Here is our scenario. We have a cross-tab layout. On the left, we have two columns of item and color. At the top, we have two rows. The first row at the top is the size, small or large. The issue is that these are merged cells, another common format that we are likely to encounter. And then below that, we have our region. In the cross section of each of those headings, we have the values. All we want to do is to unpivot all of these values. So we have a column for item, color, size, region, and values. That will turn it from a cross-tab layout into a data layout. That's our situation. Now let's go and see how we can achieve it. Let's start with the easy way. If you're a member of our Excel Academy, you have access to our Quick Calc library. This contains lots of useful Lambda functions for scenarios just like this. I'll start by clicking on the Excel off the grid ribbon. On the left, we have our function vault, which stores the Quick Calc library. If I search for the word unpivot, you can see we only have one function that contains the word unpivot. Once I've selected that function, I can then click insert, and that will insert the Lambda function into our workbook. Because we have merged cells, when we unpivot, we will have blank values, and we want to fill those blank values from the cell above. Therefore, I'll search for blank. You can see we have three Lambda functions that contain the word blank, and we want the FX fill blank cells option. And then I'll click insert. We're now ready to use these two functions. In cell H16, I'll type equals FX unpivot opening bracket. The first argument is row headings. For this, we will select the range from B5 to C12. The next argument is col headings. For this, we want to select the range D3 to K4. The next argument is values. For this, we want the range from D5 to K12. We don't need to use our last argument of new col headings array, so we can now close and calculate. And that has unpivoted all of our data and placed it into a data layout. Now I'm sure you've noticed the problem. In our size column, we have the word small followed by 3 zeros, and then the word large followed by 3 zeros. And this is because we had a merged cell. So let's edit the formula, and at the start, we're going to add our FX fill blank cells function. This function has various optional arguments. For our scenario, we only need the first argument. So we can come to the end, close the bracket and calculate. And that's it. We have now unpivoted our data and also filled blanks for any missing values. So that is the easy way of unpivoting a cross-tab layout in Excel using formulas. If you're not a member of our Excel Academy, then you won't have access to these functions, which means you might need to use the hard way. In this section, we will cover some really awesome Excel array techniques. So make sure you download the example file so you can work along with this example. The easiest cells to change into a column are the values. So that's where we are going to start. In cell F16, I'll type equals 2 col opening bracket. 2 col converts a range into a single column. So I can select the cells from D5 to K12. We don't need any of the optional arguments, so we can close that and calculate. That now creates a single column with all of our values. Next, let's calculate the item column. We have 8 columns in our data. Therefore, we want to create a repeating pattern where we have 8 ones and then 8 twos, 8 threes, and so on. We do this because it represents how many times we need to repeat each value. We're going to start with the sequence function. I'll type equals sequence opening bracket. Initially, we want a sequence of numbers that represents the number of rows in our final output. So for that, I'll use the rows function, and then we can select cell F16. And when we enter the hash symbol, that will give us the full spill range of those values. And that is how many rows we have in our dataset. When we close that bracket and calculate, we now have the numbers from 1 to 64 because we have 64 rows. Let's edit the formula, and now we want to divide by the number of columns in our dataset. So I'll enter a slash and then use the columns function. And we're going to select cells D4 to K4. When we calculate that, we now have 8 numbers between 0 and 1, 8 numbers between 1 and 2, 8 numbers between 2 and 3, and so on. Let's edit our formula. At the start, I will add the round up function. So this rounds the numbers up to a specified number of decimal places, and we want 0 decimal places. When that calculates, we now get the repeating pattern of numbers of 8 ones, 8 twos, 8 threes, and so on. Let's edit our formula one more time. At the start, we're going to add the index function, and we want the values from B5 to B12. That is our array argument. Then we're using the round up for the row num argument. So that means from the range B5 to B12, the first row, being alpha, will be repeated 8 times. The second row, being bravo, will be repeated 8 times. And the same is true for all of those other values. When we calculate, that is exactly the result that we get. Let's now copy that formula from column B into column C. And rather than referencing B5 to B12, we want to reference C5 to C12. And that now gets us our column of colors. Next, let's skip over our size column. We will come back to that, and let's focus on the region column. For this, we want a repeating pattern where we have the numbers 1 to 8, but that whole pattern is repeating multiple times. Once again, we are going to start with the sequence function. I'll enter equals sequence, opening bracket, and we want the number of rows which are contained in F16 hash. We can then close the rows function. Now for this calculation to work, we want the count to start from 0. Therefore, we're going to go to our columns argument and enter 1 because we want a single column. Next, we will go to the start argument and we want to start from 0. We can then close the sequence and calculate. We now have the sequence of numbers from 0 to 63. Next, we want to use the mod function. This returns the remainder after a number has been divided into other whole numbers. So let's edit our formula. At the start, I will add mod opening bracket. For the number argument, we want the result of our sequence function. For the divisor argument, we want the number of columns in our dataset. So let's use the columns function. We can select the range from D4 to K4. We can now close the columns and mod functions. Before we commit this formula, we need to add 1. If you remember, our sequence starts at 0, but we want the numbers from 1 to 8. Therefore, we need to plus 1. We now get the numbers from 1 to 8 repeated multiple times. Let's edit our formula. At the start, we can add the index function, and we want to return the values from D4 to K4. Because our values are in a single row, that means we don't need to use the col num argument. We can place all of our positions in the row num argument. So I'll close that bracket at the end and then calculate. That now returns all of those regions in a single column. Now let's turn our attention to the size column. So I will copy the formula for the region, then I'll come across to cell D16 and we will paste that formula. Rather than picking up the values from D4 to K4, we want to remove that, and instead we want to pick up the values from D3 to K3. And that now calculates our size column. Now the problem is, because we had merged cells at the top, we get the value of small followed by 3 zeros, and then large followed by 3 zeros. So we need to change our formula so that it always copies the value above. For this, we can use the scan function. So let's edit our formula. At the start, I will enter scan opening bracket. I'll then press Alt and Enter to create a new line in the formula. The first argument of scan is initial value. For our scenario, this initial value will be ignored, but I still need to enter a value for that. So I'm going to enter an empty text string. The second argument is the array. These are the values that we want to loop over, and this will be the result of our previous index calculation. I'll enter a comma at the end and press Alt Enter to create a new row. The third argument is function. For this, we need to use the lambda function. Scan passes across two values into that lambda function for each row in the array. And the two values it passes across are the previous result, which is known as the accumulator, and also the current value. We are going to give these the labels of A for accumulator and V for value. We can then write an if statement. We're going to say if, opening bracket, we want to check whether our value is blank. So I'll enter is blank, opening bracket, on our V. So V is the current value in the array. We can then close that bracket. If V is blank, then we want to return the previous result, which means we want to return the A, which is the accumulator. Now, if V is not blank, that means it has found one of those row labels of small or large, in which case we want it to use that value. So that means that any blank cell will be replaced with the value from above. You can then close all of those brackets and calculate. And there we go. We now have the correct values in our size column. If we scroll down, you can see that our original cells have been fully unpivoted. Now, many of you are probably thinking, what about Power Query? It's easy to unpivot in Power Query. Yes, I agree with you 100%. But we need to consider where we are in our process and what type of process we are undertaking. Power Query is all about getting and transforming inputs into a data layout. However, if we're modeling rather than analyzing data, then we may not be working with Power Query at all. Therefore, we really need to consider if we want the additional manual step of clicking the refresh button every time the inputs change. And let's face it, we could easily forget. So if you're performing data analysis, we should definitely use Power Query to unpivot the data before it even gets to the workbook. But if we're not, then the formula approach may be exactly what we need. And that is how to unpivot in Excel using formulas. If you like the sound of the easy way, then you can find the functions in our Quick Calc library, which is available inside the Excel Academy. Just head over to exceloffthegrid.com to get access. We've got loads of videos on our channel covering formulas, charts, Power Query, and much, much more. So why not go and check them out? And I think you should start with this one. I think it's another one you'll really enjoy. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.